I always knew my younger sister was the golden child, but I never imagined my parents would literally drain my inheritance to fund her third trip down the aisle. While they were busy booking a luxury Tuscan villa for her, I was quietly packing my bags to vanish. If you look up the term glass child in the dictionary, you might just find a picture of me, Chloe, staring blankly out of a window, while my younger sister, Stephanie, throws a tantrum in the foreground. For as long as I can remember, the sun rose and set on Stephanie. She was the unexpected miracle baby, born 7 years after me, and from the moment she took her first breath, my parents, Barbara and James, treated her like royalty. I was the reliable one, the one who did her homework, paid her own way through state college, and never asked for a dime. Stephanie was the hurricane. By the time I was 28, Stephanie had already been married and divorced twice. Her first wedding at 20 was a shotgun affair to a guy named Tyler, which ended in a messy annulment 6 months later when she decided she wasn't ready to be tied down. My parents paid for the entire rustic barn wedding, writing off the $30,000 loss as a learning experience for her young heart. Her second wedding, at 24, was to a personal trainer named Brandon. That one cost $50,000, featured a 10-tier cake, and ended 2 years later when Brandon emptied their joint checking account and moved to Florida. Again, my parents swooped in, paying her legal fees and letting her move back into her childhood bedroom, comforting her while ignoring the fact that she had been caught cheating on Brandon 3 months prior. I, meanwhile, had been dating David for 4 years. David was everything my family wasn't: steady, practical, and deeply empathetic. He was a high school history teacher, and I worked as an account manager for a logistics firm. We didn't live a glamorous life, but we were happy. We spent our weekends hiking, cooking together in our cramped apartment, and saving every spare penny for our future. On a rainy Tuesday evening in October, David proposed. There were no hidden photographers, no flash mobs, and no $1,000 floral arrangements. We were in our tiny kitchen, laughing over a pot of boiling pasta water, when he suddenly dropped to one knee. He held out a vintage, deep blue sapphire ring surrounded by tiny diamonds. It had belonged to his grandmother. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I said yes before he could even finish his sentence. We were over the moon. The very next morning, I called my mother, Barbara. I was practically vibrating with excitement. "Mum, David proposed last night. We're engaged," I squealed into the receiver. There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the sound of rustling papers. "Oh, that's nice, Chloe. Did he get you a diamond?" "It's a vintage sapphire, Mum. It's his grandmother's. It's gorgeous. A sapphire. Well, that's practical, I suppose," she sighed. "Listen, I can't talk long. Stephanie is having an absolute crisis over her hair extensions, and I need to run her to the salon. We'll do a family dinner on Sunday to celebrate, okay? Love you. Bye." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, the familiar heavy weight of disappointment settling in my chest. David, seeing my face, just walked over and wrapped his arms around me. "They'll come around," he whispered. "It's going to be great." Sunday rolled around. David and I arrived at my parents' sprawling suburban home right on time. My mother had made a standard roast chicken, nothing special, certainly not the prime rib she roasted when Stephanie got her real estate license, a license she abandoned a month later. My father, James, gave me a brief, one-armed hug and shook David's hand, his eyes already drifting back to the golf tournament on the television. We sat in the living room for 45 minutes, our stomachs rumbling, waiting for the guest of honor. Because, in my family, an event didn't start until Stephanie arrived. Finally, the front door burst open. Stephanie swept in, wearing a designer trench coat, her perfectly blown-out blonde hair bouncing. But she wasn't alone. Trailing behind her was Greg. Greg was Stephanie's latest obsession. They had been dating for exactly 5 months. He was a junior partner at his father's corporate law firm, wore a Rolex that he made sure everyone noticed, and had the kind of smug, practiced smile that immediately put me on edge. "Sorry we're late," Stephanie announced, not sounding sorry at all. "We have the most amazing news," my mother gasped, practically leaping out of her armchair. "Oh my God, Steffi, what is it?" Stephanie thrust her left hand into the air. On her ring finger sat a blinding, gaudy 3-carat diamond halo ring. It looked heavy enough to cause nerve damage. "Greg proposed. We're getting married." The room erupted. My mother burst into theatrical, sobbing tears, throwing her arms around Stephanie and then Greg. My father jumped up, his face flushed with joy, and went straight to the liquor cabinet to pull out a bottle of expensive champagne he had been saving for years. "I knew it. I knew he was the one," my mother wailed happily. "Oh, my baby girl is finally getting her happily ever after." David and I sat on the sofa, entirely frozen. We had been engaged for exactly 5 days. This dinner was supposed to be our celebration. My father popped the champagne and poured generous glasses for everyone. He raised his flute high. "To Stephanie and Greg, may this be the beautiful, forever love you deserve." "To Stephanie and Greg," my mother echoed, clinking her glass against Greg's. They drank, they laughed. They immediately started rapid-fire discussions about venues, guest lists, and designer dresses. For 20 minutes, David and I were utterly invisible. Finally, during a lull in the wedding chatter, David cleared his throat. "So," David said, his voice polite but carrying a distinct edge. "Chloe and I have also been looking at some venues. We're thinking a spring wedding." Greg looked at David, amused. "Oh, you guys are engaged, too. Congrats, man. Let me guess. Backyard BBQ." Stephanie giggled, twirling her massive diamond. "Oh, Chloe, don't be silly. You and David don't need a big wedding. You're so low-key. Besides, Mum and Dad are going to have their hands full with mine. Greg's family has a massive social circle. We're thinking Lake Como, or maybe a chateau in the south of France." I looked at my mother, waiting for her to intervene, waiting for her to say, "Actually, we're celebrating your sister tonight." Instead, Barbara just nodded eagerly. "Oh, Lake Como is stunning, Steffi. We'll have to fly out next month to look at properties." I looked down at my beautiful, modest sapphire. The blue suddenly looked very cold. I squeezed David's hand, and without a word, we both knew. We were entirely on our own. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into planning our wedding, determined not to let my family's blatant favoritism ruin my joy. David and I knew we were working with a strict budget. As a teacher and an account manager, we didn't have unlimited funds, but we had a clear vision. An intimate ceremony at the city's historic botanical greenhouse, surrounded by 50 of our closest friends and family, followed by dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant. We had saved about $10,000 ourselves, but I was counting on one specific safety net. When my grandfather, Arthur, passed away 8 years ago, he left a small trust. In his will, he explicitly earmarked $15,000 for each of his 3 granddaughters, myself, Stephanie, and our older cousin, Rebecca, to be used specifically for a wedding or a down payment on a first home. Because I was only 20 at the time, My parents were named the executors of the funds, tasked with holding the money in a high-yield account until I was ready to claim it. With the $15,000 from Grandpa Arthur, David and I could comfortably pay for the greenhouse, the catering, and a modest honeymoon to the Pacific Northwest without going into debt. I called my parents on a Saturday morning to arrange a visit. I told my mother I needed to discuss wedding finances and asked if we could sit down and look over the paperwork for Grandpa Arthur's fund. "Of course, sweetheart. Come on over," Barbara had said, her tone breezy. When David and I arrived at their house, the dining room table was entirely covered in glossy Italian bridal magazines, fabric swatches, and thick, cream-colored cardstock. My mother and father were hunched over an iPad, arguing about the cost of importing white orchids to Lombardy. "Hi, Mum, Dad," I said, lingering in the doorway. "Chloe, David, come look at this," my mother gestured frantically. "Greg's mother insists on a 5-course plated dinner, but the caterer in Como is quoting us €300 a head. Can you believe the extortion?" "Mum, I actually came to talk about my wedding," I said, my voice steady. I pulled out a neat folder containing our budget and venue contracts. We found a gorgeous greenhouse. We just need to put down the deposit next week. I wanted to talk about transferring Grandpa Arthur's money into my account so I can write the check. The room went dead silent. My father slowly put down the iPad. My mother stopped shuffling the fabric swatches and looked up at me, her face pale, adopting a look I had come to recognize over the years as her guilt face. "Well, sweetie," Barbara started, her voice dropping an octave into a sickeningly sweet register. "We actually need to have a conversation about that." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "About what?" "The money is in a trust. I'm engaged. I meet the criteria." My father cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze. "Chloe, you know how hard things have been for your sister. Her first 2 marriages, they broke her heart. She was so young, so foolish. But Greg is different. He's from a very prominent family." "What does Greg's family have to do with my inheritance, Dad?" I snapped, my patience instantly evaporating. Barbara wrung her hands. "The destination wedding it's very expensive, Chloe. Greg's parents are paying for the rehearsal dinner, but tradition dictates the bride's family pays for the wedding. We had to liquidate some assets to afford the deposits for Lake Como." I stared at them. The silence stretched so tight I thought my eardrums would burst. "You liquidated assets? What assets exactly?" My mother finally looked me in the eye. "We used the trust, Chloe. Your grandfather's money." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "You did what?" he demanded, his normally calm voice vibrating with shock. "We had to," my father suddenly boomed, stepping in to defend his wife. "Stephanie is marrying into high society. We can't have them thinking we're some middle-class nobodies who can't afford a proper European wedding. Besides, Chloe, you and David are doing a little greenhouse thing. You don't need $15,000 for some plants and a pasta dinner." My vision literally blurred with rage. "That was my money. Grandpa Arthur left it for me. You legally stole my inheritance to pay for Stephanie's 3rd wedding." "Don't use that word," my mother shrieked, clutching her pearls. Literally, she was wearing pearls. "We didn't steal anything. We are the executors. We have discretion over how the family funds are distributed. We were going to pay you back eventually, over the next few years. You're being incredibly selfish and unsupportive of your sister's happiness." "Selfish?" I laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that scraped my throat. "You funded a $30,000 mistake with Tyler. You funded a $50,000 disaster with Brandon. And now you're stealing from my dead grandfather To fund an $80,000 vanity project for a guy she's known for 5 months. Get out, my father said, his face purple with fury. If you are going to stand in my house and insult your sister, you can leave. We will not have this negativity ruining Stephanie's special time. I looked at these two people who had spent 28 years making me feel like an afterthought, a background character in the grand, chaotic play of Stephanie's life. I realized in that exact second that I was done. There was no argument I could win, no logic that would penetrate their delusion. Fine, I said softly. I picked up my folder. Keep the money. Consider it the price of never having to deal with me again. I turned and walked out the front door, David right on my heels. When we got into our battered Honda Civic, the adrenaline suddenly crashed, and I burst into violent, shaking sobs. I cried for the loss of the wedding I had planned, for the money that was rightfully mine. But mostly, I cried because the final shred of hope that my parents would ever truly love me equally was gone. David didn't start the car. He just unbuckled his seatbelt, pulled me across the center console, and held me tightly while I wept into his shoulder. He stroked my hair until my sobs turned into hiccups. "I'm so sorry, Chloe," he whispered fiercely into my hair. "They don't deserve you. They never did." I pulled back, wiping my mascara-stained cheeks. "We have no money for the greenhouse now. We have to cancel everything. I don't want a cheap, thrown-together wedding while they flaunt their stolen Italian vacation." David looked out the windshield, his jaw tight. Then a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. It was a look I rarely saw on him, rebellious and resolute. "Who says we have to cancel?" David asked quietly. "We have 10 grand of our own money. Let's not spend it on catering and chair rentals to impress people who don't care about us." I sniffled, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, taking both of my hands in his, "let's take our savings. Let's fly to the cliffs of Acadia National Park. Just you, me, and an officiant. Let's elope, secretly. We won't tell a single soul." "But what about my family?" David's eyes gleamed. "We let them think we're still planning a cheap little local wedding. We let them go off to Lake Como and play pretend with Greg's snobby family. We cut them off entirely, on our own terms, when the time is right." The seed was planted, and as I looked into David's eyes, I felt a spark of pure, unadulterated vengeance mixed with profound liberation. My family had ignored me, robbed me, and discarded me. It was time to write my own script, and the twist I was about to deliver would be something they would never, ever forget. The next 6 months were a master class in deception. To my parents and Stephanie, I became a shadow. I stopped bringing up my own wedding plans entirely, which, predictably, they didn't even notice. Whenever we were forced to attend a wedding planning brunch for Stephanie, I played the role of the supportive, slightly dowdy older sister perfectly. I listened to her moan about the shade of the silk ribbons for the programs and the utter disaster of Greg's groomsmen wanting to wear charcoal instead of midnight navy. "It must be so hard for you, Chloe," Stephanie said one afternoon, sipping a mimosa, while a seamstress pinned her $12,000 gown. "Watching me do all this luxury stuff when you and David are, well, doing whatever it is you're doing. Are you still doing that little greenhouse thing?" "We're figuring it out, Steph," I said, keeping my voice neutral. In reality, David and I were living a double life. Every night, after I finished my logistics reports and he finished grading history papers, we'd sit at our kitchen table with a map of the Maine coastline. We weren't just planning a wedding, we were planning a disappearance. We had stopped visiting my parents' house unless it was absolutely necessary. When my mother called to complain that the family funds were getting tight because Greg's father had backed out of paying for the vintage boat arrivals in Como, I simply told her, "That sounds stressful, Mom," and hung up. I didn't remind her that the money she was missing was the money she had stolen from me. I didn't need to. I had something better. We had hired a photographer named Sarah, a rugged woman who specialized in adventure elopements. We told her our story, the whole ugly truth. She was so fired up on our behalf that she helped us find a secluded cliffside in Acadia that required a 2-mile hike at dawn to reach. "The light there at 5:30 a.m. is like something out of a dream," Sarah told us over Zoom. "It'll just be you, the ocean, and the pine trees. No drama, no thieves." 2 weeks before Stephanie's grand Italian departure, I received a group text from my father. "James, remainder of the Lake Como bills are due. Chloe, we know you've been saving. Since you haven't booked your greenhouse yet, we expect you to contribute $5,000 to the family fund. It's for your sister's legacy. We'll pay you back when the house sells in 5 years." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. They weren't just content with stealing my inheritance. They wanted my personal savings too. They truly viewed me as a communal ATM for Stephanie's whims. I didn't reply. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply blocked their numbers. David did the same. We left on a Tuesday. While my parents were busy packing 3 trunks each for their flight to Milan, David and I threw 2 backpacks and a garment bag into the back of our car. We drove 10 hours north, the air getting saltier and cooler with every mile. On Thursday morning, as the sun began to bleed orange and purple over the Atlantic, I stood on a granite ledge overlooking the crashing waves of the Maine coast. I wasn't wearing a $12,000 gown. I was wearing a simple, elegant white lace dress that I had bought off the rack, and my hiking boots were tucked under the hem. David stood opposite me in a sharp grey suit, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and pure, unadulterated love. There were no bridesmaids, no white orchids, and no smug lawyers named Greg. There was just the sound of the wind and the voice of the local officiant, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, who looked like he had been carved out of the very cliffs we stood upon. "Do you, Chloe, take David?" As I said "I do," I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders. The shackles of being the reliable one, the glass child, and the afterthought shattered. I wasn't Chloe, the girl whose parents stole her money. I was Chloe, a woman who belonged to herself and to the man who truly saw her. After the ceremony, Sarah took photos of us popping a bottle of cheap sparkling cider and eating lobster rolls on the rocks. We spent the next 3 days in a tiny cabin with no cell service, hiking through the pines and watching the stars. It was the most expensive $10,000 I had ever spent, and it was worth every single penny. But the real drama was only just beginning, because while we were in our cabin, Stephanie's wedding of the century was about to implode in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. We returned to the world on Monday morning. I turned my phone back on as we crossed the state line back into Massachusetts. The device nearly vibrated out of my hand. 142 missed calls, 86 text messages, 12 voicemails. Most were from my mother. The tone of the texts shifted from "Where are you?" to "Chloe, answer me now," to "Everything is ruined." I sat in the passenger seat and began to scroll, my heart hammering against my ribs. Apparently, while David and I were exchanging vows on a cliff, the perfect Greg had a bit too much to drink at the pre-wedding dinner at the villa in Como. In front of my parents, Greg's parents, and 60 guests, Greg had gotten into a screaming match with Stephanie. Why? because Greg's prominent family wasn't actually prominent. It turned out Greg's father's law firm was under federal investigation for embezzlement. The Rolex was a fake. The social circle Greg had bragged about was a house of cards built on debt. Greg had been counting on Stephanie's wealthy parents to provide a massive cash infusion after the wedding to help cover his personal debts. When Greg found out, via a drunken conversation with my father, that my parents had reached the bottom of their savings and had resorted to using a small trust fund just to pay for the flowers, he lost it. He called Stephanie a broke social climber in front of everyone. Stephanie, in true golden child fashion, had responded by throwing a bottle of expensive red wine at his head, shattering it against a 16th century fresco. The Italian authorities were called. The wedding was cancelled. The villa owner was suing for damages to the fresco. And because my parents had signed all the contracts, they were on the hook for the entire disastrous bill. I reached my parents' house that evening. I didn't want to go, but I had one final thing to do. I walked through the front door without knocking. The living room looked like a funeral parlor. My mother was slumped on the sofa, her face puffy and red. My father was staring at a pile of legal documents on the coffee table. Stephanie was curled in an armchair, still wearing a bride tracksuit, sobbing hysterically. "Chloe!" my mother gasped, standing up unsteadily. "Where have you been? We've been calling you for days. We need you. We need your savings. The villa owner is threatening to sue us in international court, and Greg's family has vanished. They're penniless, Chloe. We were lied to." I stood in the center of the room, my hands in my pockets. I looked at Stephanie, then at my parents. I felt no pity, only a strange, cold clarity. "I don't have any savings left, Mum," I said calmly. My father looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean? You had $10,000. We told you to keep it for the family fund." "I spent it," I said. "Spent it on what?" Stephanie shrieked, looking up through her smeared mascara. "On some stupid logistics seminar? On a new car? How could you be so selfish when I'm going through a literal nightmare?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, high-gloss, 8x10 photograph that Sarah had printed for me at a 24-hour lab on our way home. It was the shot of David and me on the cliff, the sun hitting the sapphire on my finger, our faces radiant with a joy none of them had ever given me. I walked over and placed it on the coffee table, right on top of the Italian legal bills. "I spent it on my wedding," I said. "David and I eloped 5 days ago. We're married." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. My mother's mouth fell open. My father's face went from pale to a dangerous shade of purple. You got married? Without us?" my mother whispered, her voice trembling with outrage. "How could you, after everything we've done for you?" "Everything you've done for me?" I asked, my voice rising for the first time. "You mean stealing the money Grandpa Arthur specifically left for me? You mean ignoring my engagement to fund a third wedding for a girl who can't even pick a decent man? You mean treating me like a backup plan for 28 years? We are your parents," my father roared, standing up. "You owe us." "I owe you nothing," I countered, stepping toward him. "Grandpa Arthur left that money to me. That was a legal trust, and you violated your fiduciary duty as executors. I spoke to a lawyer this morning." That shut him up. The purple drained from his face, replaced by a sickly grey. "I'm not going to sue you," I continued, my voice dropping back to a whisper. "Not because I love you, but because I know you don't have the money anyway. You spent it all on a fresco and a fraud. That's your karma. But here's what's going to happen. You are never going to call me for money again. You are never going to mention Stephanie's needs to me again. And you are going to stay out of my life until you can figure out how to be parents instead of enablers. I looked at Stephanie. Good luck with the lawsuit, Steph. Maybe Tyler or Brandon can give you some advice on how to handle a mess. I turned on my heel and walked out. As I reached my car, where David was waiting with the engine running, I heard my mother start to wail my name from the front porch. I didn't look back. We drove away, leaving the suburbs behind. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the girl waiting for her turn. I had taken my turn. I had taken my life back. And as David reached over and squeezed my hand, the blue of my sapphire catching the streetlights, I knew that the drama was finally over. The real story, our story, was just beginning. They thought I was the easy target, the one who would always sacrifice her own dreams to cushion my sister's falls. But by stealing my past, they gave me the freedom to vanish into my future. My family is currently drowning in the debt of a wedding that never happened, while I am building a home filled with the one thing they couldn't buy: genuine, quiet, and unbreakable respect.